Good morning and welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Today is Monday, September 26th, 2022. Lots of news over the weekend, lots of news today. All sorts of different interesting things. By the way, big question for today's podcast. Will the world face an underpopulation crisis? We're going to speak with Marian Tupy from Cato Institute, who co-authored a new book arguing that the collapse of population in Western nations could create an economic and cultural crisis, and that the resources of this world are almost limitless and we should stop indulging in Malthusianism. Really great conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy this, and hopefully you'll enjoy the book as well. That's coming up. However, today, probably the biggest news over the last 24 hours or so has been the Washington Post ABC News poll, which is unusual because normally we would sniff at this, but it is actually sort of a bellwether of, I think, where the midterm polling is going to go. Now, the top line number on this thing showed that Republicans had a 1-point edge in the generic congressional poll, which is, pretty good because anything better than a D+5 on generic ballots is usually a pretty good sign for Republicans. And especially when you factor in, first term midterms, unpopular president who's supposedly been bouncing back of late, that sort of thing. You would expect that to be pretty good news, especially from the Washington Post ABC series, which is usually pretty friendly to Democrats. However, if you drill down into this a little bit more, and I admit, I actually missed this at first until somebody pointed it out to me. That was the registered voter result. The likely voter model result was R+5. And Joe Biden at 39% in terms of job approval. Actually, I think the 39% may have been registered voters. And if you take a look at the polling that's been going on, and bear in mind, we have states that are actually starting to vote now, right? I mean, early voting has started, I think, in Pennsylvania at least, and maybe a couple of other states. And pollsters are still using a registered voter model. The polls that, at least on the generic ballot, right? The polls that come back on RV are almost all favorable to Democrats, although maybe not favorable enough. Again, Democrats really need to be at like a D+5 for just a hold, right? Let alone gain seats. And there's all sorts of structural reasons for that. This is just a phenomenon that we're used to dealing with in the congressional ballot. But when the polls that use likely voter models, including the Washington Post poll, all come back with Republican leads. With one exception, I think there was one exception that was a tie, but there isn't a Democrat league among any of the likely voter model polls. And so you have to ask yourself, why are pollsters still not applying likely voter modeling to their polling results? Why are they not testing for that? And the answer seems to be that Republicans are a lot more enthusiastic, and that would create a maybe a little too real of a result. That this, despite all of the media coverage, despite the spin, despite the talk about abortion, that the red wave is still coming. And you can take a look at the Washington Post ABC poll results. And in fact, I took a look at it yesterday. David Strom took a look at it this morning. Both are extremely popular posts, and so you'll want to read both of them. But if you take a look at this, you take a look at the issues, right? And the media has been pounding on abortion all summer long at the expense of inflation. Inflation's not a problem. This is the reason why Joe Biden held his silly mission accomplished party on September 13th. They scheduled it for the afternoon of the morning when the Consumer Price Index report came out. And the Consumer Price Index report showed that year-on-year inflation is still at 8.3%. Core inflation actually went up in August. So it was a supremely stupid decision on their part to have a mission accomplished party on inflation. But if you take a look at the issues, abortion comes in fifth. If you take a look at the most important or very important issues, and this is multi-choice in the Washington Post ABC survey, and abortion comes in fifth. What comes in first? Inflation, well, the economy, inflation, crime, immigration. All of those are above abortion and climate change, which are the fifth and sixth issues on the list if you actually calculate out that. And those are the two issues that Democrats want to make the midterms about. Joe Biden's at 39%. They want to make the midterms a referendum on Donald Trump. It doesn't appear to be working. And if you're getting that kind of a result from the Washington Post ABC poll, it's really not working. So that's sort of the top story. It's the most trafficked story, I guess you can say, on Hot Air over the last couple of days. There's obviously lots of other things going on. The latest from Russia is really curious, which is Patriarch Kirill's call to martyrdom in Ukraine for Russian Orthodox men. Now, Vladimir Putin is having a very bad time mobilizing more forces for Ukraine. They're having to basically Shanghai people. We used to call it Shanghaiing. We'll call it impressment, in case anybody's offended by the term Shanghaiing them. But they're having to basically use impressment to seize men for cannon fodder. These are not going to be effective troops, combat effective troops. And in a post that I have this morning, I rely on Institute for the Study of War. It's at understandingwar.org to talk about all the reasons why the Russian mobilization regime is completely incompetent. There's really good reasons for that. But I mean, you can see it on the streets. People are being seized. Anti-war protesters are being drafted by police on the spot. If you're filling your ranks with anti-war protesters, criminals, and dissidents, you're not going to field an effective combat force. I mean, you're just simply not. What you're going to get is a whole lot of officers fragged as all those people run from the battle. Those are people who are not committed to fighting. Needless to say, this is not even analogous to the American draft of the late 1960s, early 1970s. I mean, that draft was, it had its own issues, but it was never anything this bad. And the idea that you're going to form those types of conscripts into an effective fighting force is simply fantasy. It's absolute fantasy. And the idea that they're going to listen to Kirill and march off into martyrdom so that they can die for Holy Russia and have their sins washed away, and that's a quote, washed away by their death in Ukraine, is almost pathological. if not entirely pathological. Theologically, it's pathological. It's insane. And that type of martyrdom call is really a last act of desperation. That's what you do when you can't get anybody to sign up for your little war. And Patriarch Kirill, I suspect that Patriarch Kirill at his heart is an atheist. And I think Putin is his secular god, but we can maybe put that aside for later. This is desperation time. And you've even got some of the people who are the biggest cheerleaders for this. I can't remember her name, Simonian, at RT, who's been the biggest cheerleader for the war in Ukraine, criticizing Putin over the way that the mobilization is taking place and the sick people that they're having to conscript into the army. I mean, that's not a good sign. That your domestic tranquility is going to be reliable. There was a report over the weekend that Vladimir Putin spent the weekend outside of Moscow, hiding out in his forest palace. Apparently pretty nice. It sort of harkens back to the Soviet era, where all of the leaders had these really cushy dachas, and some people are more equal than others in the Soviet system, and apparently that hasn't changed in modern Russia. But that is desperation. That's sheer desperation. Maybe we'll get, we should try to get somebody on to talk about that this week, because, or at least Kirill's role in that, because it's absolutely insane. And so that's another post that went up this morning. Hopefully you got a chance to read through that. Lots of other stuff going on. You got David Strom's take on the Washington Post poll. Karen Townsend's doing some really great stuff today, talking about Eric Adams building a tent city in the Bronx for immigrants, and the locals are very much not happy about that. And I also have something about the Italian elections, where the right, the parties on the right end up winning, and you've got a full-on media freakout over the most right-wing government in Italy since Benito Mussolini. Well, that's not hard to do. We've been electing people from the left and the far left ever since Benito Mussolini. If Mitt Romney won, in Italy, he'd be the most right-wing person that they've ever elected. Even Silvio Berlusconi was not really right-wing. He was sort of a center-left populist who just got under the EU's skin. I mean, it's such a silly response. This is, Georgia Meloni is somebody who's working with Mario Draghi at the moment and has built built engagement with other parties on the left. I mean, that's not a fascist model. Fascist model is autocracy. This is not a fascist model. Now, could it turn into a fascist model? Sure. Then at that point you start worrying about it. But all this is just simple conservatism. And the media is in full freak out mode, invoking the name of Benito Mussolini for God knows what reason. It's insane. And so be careful when you're hearing all this about the Italian elections. That's my advice to you. At any rate, let's go now to to my interview with Marian Tupy about the coming underpopulation crisis. It's sort of like the reverse population bomb, which comes up for a mention or two in our discussion. And stick around at the end for information on how you can subscribe to both this podcast and our VIP and VIP Gold memberships. Thanks for listening. Don't miss a minute of the Ed Morrissey Show. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Is the world overpopulated or is it underpopulated? We are going to discuss that today with Marian Tupy, who just wrote a great column over at Town Hall a few days ago. Does the world face an underpopulation problem? And talk also about the book Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Marian, great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be on your show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And look, I mean, I think it's, I always like counterintuitive takes, right? But if you've grown up in the last 50 years, 52 years, really, since the population bomb was published, I mean, I think that everybody thinks, well, the world is overpopulated. I think that there's differences and how to address that. I don't think, you need to go the full nihilist approach that the population bomb sort of advocated. But you're arguing that actually the world is underpopulated and a population crash is much more dangerous to humanity than an expanding human population. Tell us a little bit about how you came to that.
I wasn't suggesting that the world is underpopulated at present, but that it could be underpopulated in the future, and that has serious consequences that we need to be talking about now. One of those consequences is that the United States has a massive debt and is running a huge deficit every year, and we will need people in the future to be able to pay it down. And the United States is just one example of many countries in developed, advanced world who have huge amounts of debt. We will need people to do that. The other part is, of course, that our governments in the West, in advanced countries, have promised to future generations all sorts of goodies that we don't know how we are going to pay for, including Social Security. So if you are going to have a collapse of population, where is that money for the future retirees going to come from? And these, believe it or not, are actually some of the lesser concerns. A bigger concern, much bigger concern, is, of course, that human brain is the driver of economic and technological and scientific progress. So if the human population is going to decline, then in the future we are also going to have much less economic growth, and that means a poorer world. That's something that I think people like Elon Musk have on their mind when they are talking about the danger of depopulation.
Yeah, and I certainly, if you're looking at it from a long-term fiscal perspective, I mean, we're already seeing some of the consequences of that. And some of that is because people live longer. For instance, you mentioned Social Security, right? Social Security was implemented in the 1930s. When you had, I think the ratio was 15 workers to a retiree, because the average life expectancy in America at that time was somewhere in the early to mid 60s, right? I mean, I'd be coming up, it's kind of a depressing thought, but I'd be coming up to that average lifespan here pretty quick under those conditions. And of course, because we've had all of this great innovation and great research and new developments in medicine and technology, people are living a lot longer, so they're retired a lot longer. And so you've got more retirees per worker, or probably a better way of putting this is, because that's actually not quite accurate. You've got fewer workers per retiree. I think it's down to like 3 to 1 or 2.5 to 1 at this point in time, which is a huge problem when it comes to floating programs like Social Security. And as you say, the United States is not the only country that has this problem. Most of Europe has this problem. China has this problem. They created that one for themselves. In fact, Russia is another great example of a country that's got a huge problem in terms of even just replacing the population they have right now. So, yeah, I mean, in the sense, when you're talking about safety net programs, we're already there, right? We're already underpopulated.
Yes, our pyramid is certainly not as healthy as it used to be. American birth rates right now for native-born women are 1.7 per woman per lifetime, and you need 2.1 to just keep population at a replacement level. America is still growing because of immigration, but this is not an avenue which is open to a number of other countries. In South Korea, for example, typical woman has 0.9 children on average per lifetime. And again, as I said, they need 2.1. So it is a serious problem. And of course, I believe in freedom. I believe that men and women who get together should be able to choose as many babies as they want. What I don't want is for them to be making these very personal and intimate decisions made on the basis of unjustifiable, unjust, and completely invented feelings of doom and gloom about the future. So to the extent that our intellectual environment is dominated about these visions of the apocalypse in the future, what I'm saying is slow down a little. Have as many babies as you want, but just don't listen to people who are telling you the world is on fire, that we are going to run out of resources, that humans are a cancer on the planet, or that it is a selfish act to bring a child into the world. Have as many as you want, but don't listen to the doomsters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is it's a cultural thing, right? And again, I think this goes back to probably the pill in the very early 1960s, but more than that, probably population bomb and a lot of apocalyptic predictions about peak oil, peak everything, right? Peak resources. You're too young to have gone through 1970s cinema, but I can tell you, there was a lot of movies about the this apocalyptic vision of a world that had run out of resources. Soylent Green comes to mind. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Soylent Green.
Of course, I had to see it. I had to see it partly because of the work that we are doing. But let's not forget, Soylent Green is a direct outcome of the 1968 population bomb. It was filmed in 1973. But the key to say about Soylent Green is, of course, that it's supposed to be happening in 2022.
That's right.
This year, yes. It was based in the future, but the future was 2022. That's this year. So I think it's quite opposite that we have come with this book in this year, because it shows you how crazy and completely unsupportable those kinds of worries have been in the past.
So I had actually forgotten that it was set in 2022. You're correct. You're right. It's very opposite that we're coming to this right now. So when you hear people saying, well, look, the world is just too large. We're not able to feed people. I think the thing that you hear about now is water, right? Water resources. I mean, especially because, again, the United States is going through a drought, and I think Europe has I think Spain and a couple of the other European countries are going through a drought. Droughts are nothing new, by the way. Droughts come and go. But two things on that. And again, we're speaking with Marian Tupy, who's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. I really should mention that because I love the Cato Institute and the work that they do there. First off, we tend to think of these things, including hot weather, as man-made, A, and B, sort of a point of no return. And I think when you're talking about, don't listen to the doomsayers, all you're hearing is doom, right? The world is warming, and it's never going to go backwards. And to me, it's almost like a kind of presentism, Marian, which is to say, Well, we know the climate that we've experienced as an industrial society for 200 years, and we just think that that's a representative record of the climate record of a planet that's around 4 billion years old and has many, many, many climate shifts in its thing. I'm not saying that climate, isn't an issue. I'm not saying that resources might not be limited, but we keep seeming to go over this. It's like chewing the same thing all over again without realizing how much we really don't know.
Well, the difference between us and other animals is that we can plan for the future, we have self-awareness, and most importantly, we have intelligence. So when we encounter a problem, we try to solve it. Water is a perfect example of a problem which is not really a problem at all. The world is covered, 75% of it, by water. It's just the wrong kind of water, and we already know how to turn wrong kind of water into right kind of water. It's called desalination. You just build a plant, and then you take salt water and turn it into fresh water. Israel right now recycles 92% of its water. And whatever other water they need, they just use desalination plants. And that enables Israel, which has almost no natural water reserves, to not only be an agricultural superpower, they are exporting agricultural produce to the rest of the world, but also they have enough water to sustain themselves and to export it to other surrounding Arab countries. So the difference between drought and not having access to water and having plentiful water is just human intelligence and a goal-oriented society and far-thinking politicians who make these decisions. Now, I realize that far-thinking politician is a bit of an oxymoron, but clearly some countries are able to plan for the future much better than others. And it is perhaps because Israel is under so much external threat that they have to have the long-term view, whereas we don't. Part of the reason why we don't have enough water in, say, for example, out west, is because water is still mispriced. It is very, very cheap. Nobody has any incentive to be looking for new deposits of water. Once water goes up in price, that will be a market signal to investors in the private sector to look for other water deposits, or to start saving water, or to come up with alternatives, such as, for example, doing desalination. So market signal and human brain within the market can overcome all of these shortages. I think that when people are worried about water, but they could be worried about anything, they could be worried about copper or lithium or anything, is that they look at a problem and they think that technology is dynamic, but technology is not dynamic. It's the technology is not dynamic, but in fact, technology is dynamic. Technology continues to evolve, and especially in an environment where you have market shocks or prices spiking, a lot more people have an incentive now to go and invent something that will get us beyond those shortages, because they are looking for a profit motive. For that, you have to have really just a society which values entrepreneurs, society which values human beings, human intelligence, and also which allows for the market to function and profit to be made.
So it sounds like you're talking about capitalism, but I know you can't be talking about that because that gets us kicked off of Facebook and Twitter. No, I'm
very much talking about capitalism. I grew up under socialism, and it wasn't great. I'm much happier here.
Let's talk a little bit about that dynamic too. I mean, I'm a huge free market kind of guy. I like talking about capitalism. I think that a well-regulated, lightly regulated free market is incredibly dynamic, incredibly innovative, in just the same way that you're talking about. I want to marry that concept up with population, because I think this is the key, and I think it might be one of the key points that you're going to make in the book. And I really should read off the book title again: Superabundance: The Story of Population Growth, Innovation, and Human Flourishing on an Infinitely Bountiful Planet. And it's that the innovation power of populations grow when populations grow, right? The more minds you have working on issues, the better solutions end up emerging. And so I think it's one way to look at the technological arc of the 20th century going into the 21st century. You go from agrarian societies that are starting to industrialize in the 19th century, and they start industrializing, and the population expands in large part because people die less at younger ages, right? And so you get this swell of population, which translates then to some incredible innovations. I mean, you look back 120 years ago to today, and it's an amazing advancement in human human technology in a very tiny slice of human history. And does that come from having larger populations that simply can work with each other to come up with more and more technological advances?
To a large extent, in our book, we say that superabundance equals population times freedom. Obviously, having more people in the world is not enough. China became the world's most populous country 2,000 years ago, but until very recently, it was dirt poor. The reason why China is now one of the largest economies in the world, if not the largest, although their GDP per capita is smaller than ours, is because in 1978, they stopped killing each other and instead they embraced the market mechanism. Maybe not perfectly. Freedom in China is much lesser than it is in the United States, but they stopped pursuing crazy communist political and economic ideals. So population is very important. In 1800, there was only 1 billion people in the world. Now there are 8 of us. And let's not forget, not all of us are innovators. There is only a small sliver of population which innovates at any given time, maybe 5%. So 5% of 1 billion is much less in terms of absolute numbers than 5% of 8 billion. When you combine it with the spread of economic and political freedom, again, something that happened by and large in 19th and 20th centuries, many more countries now are economically and politically free than ever before. You have this galvanizing effect, which can contribute to the creation of superabundance. So freedom is important, but the human brain, as I said, is very important because it's only in the human brain that a new idea can be born, a new idea which can lead to an invention. That gets tested in the marketplace. And at the end of that process, you have a valuable innovation, which can increase standards of living, productivity, make us all richer, and drive prices down. In fact, in our book, we find that every 1% increase in population decreases prices by 1%.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison. Now, have we seen large-scale decreases in human population? We certainly did during the Black Plague, for instance. I'm not sure how much we can glean from technological setbacks during that period, but up until the 20th century, really up until the second half of the 20th century, had we ever seen sort of artificially imposed population growth, or or reverse population growth in the human experience? And if we have, what do you learn from those periods?
Well, I was recently thinking when the Bronze Age started, we get Homer's Iliad from that time, the Trojan War. There were only 14 million people in the world. 14 million, that's 1/4. That's very little. And there have been times when the bottlenecks, when a variety of disasters, which may not have been connected to each other, have resulted in these bottlenecks where actually there were only a few hundred or a few thousand people around the world. So actually we've come close to extinction before. But the human population tended to fluctuate. So, for example, at the time of Christ or Caesar Augustus, for those who are secularly inclined, there was only about 300 million people in the world, maybe somewhere between 300 and 400 million. 1,000 years later, or 1,500 years later, the world's population is still only around 400 million, 500 million. So population tended to fluctuate. The only time when we have seen a sustained increase in population was also the age of sustained innovation. People have always innovated, but they have never innovated in sustained fashion. So occasionally you would have an innovation, which would then be the only innovation for thousands of years. But it's only in the last 200 years that people have innovated basically every day. And they have done so, I think, partly because of this political and economic freedom, which has spread at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century.
Well, political and economic freedom. And I think that's also expressed in a much more diverse division of labor too, right? The innovators can afford to innovate because they're free to innovate because there's a division of labor, a sort of an incredibly diverse division of labor that happens in free societies and free market societies where you don't have top-down control of the economy and dictates as to who works where and who does what. So people can gravitate towards their expertise, or at least they have the freedom to do that. And they should be able to do that more. And I think this is the reason why you see much more innovation in countries with lower populations. And I think this is another point that you're probably going to raise in your book as well, like the United States as compared to China, like the United States, maybe, 80, 90 years ago as compared to the Russian Empire, even the British Empire to some extent. It had to do with the fact that there was mobility, I guess, economic mobility built into those systems.
Well, yes, when agriculture was very primitive and very unproductive, then, of course, everybody had to work in agriculture in order to be able to produce the food which they ate that very day. As late as 1900, 50%, forgive me, 40% of Americans were involved in agriculture. They were agricultural laborers. So obviously we had many fewer people to be engaged in science or medicine or technology and that sort of thing. But now that all of our food can be produced by 1.5% of Americans, not just for the United States, but the rest of the world. I mean, we feed not just America, but also other countries. That means that people no longer have to be doing back-breaking work in the fields. They can now go and study, can go off to university, get advanced degrees, and busy themselves in STEM. Of course, the United States is, our population is only 330 million, but we are a part of a global exchange of information that is in itself a product of liberalism with small l. I want to emphasize that. People around the world use the word liberalism very different than we use it in the United States. By liberalism, I just mean freedom. It's classical liberalism. And we are part of this liberal economy, so to speak, or the free market economy, where we are able to interact with people all around the world. The 1.5 billion people in India, the 1.3 billion people in China, to the extent that they are permitted to talk to us, we can exchange information with them. The whole of Western Europe. So we are part of this tremendous thinking machine, which is enabled by a lot of things, including the dramatically declining cost of information exchange and transfer.
And this is, I think, getting back to the point of depopulation, right? First off, you lose that vast interconnected network of innovators and thinkers and designers and builders. But what you also lose is some of the division of labor. If you have a population collapse at this point in time, a lot of people are going to have to start making their own food again. And so, growing their own food. Yeah, I'm a farmer. But you're going to go back to subsistence living for a lot higher percentage of the population that remains. If you have this, you hear this, Marian, you hear people say, well, what we really need is we need to get the human population down to 1 billion people. And it's always them that is going to be part of the billion that's left. I mean, that's,
of course. That's same thing like when people say that life in the past was better. That's because they imagine that they would be reincarnated as a princess or a knight rather than a peasant, covered in excrement, bent over in the field.
Go watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail and the whole Dennis the Peasant sketch, and you get an idea of what it was like to be alive in those times. Exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, the world could go down to 1 billion people, but our standards of living would be just reduced by orders of magnitude, and it would be a horrible world to live in.
And again, it would be most of the population would have to go back to subsistence living, including in places where that has not been the case for decades, if not a century or more. And those are the places that are the innovators at the moment. The West, for instance, even to some extent China, which has, at least moved their standard of living away enough from And we can get into the methods of that, but that's not really the point of your book. But everybody, I think, would end up, you'd be talking about the kind of dark ages that we used to talk about, prior to the Renaissance.
Yeah, and a lot of knowledge would be lost as well. This has happened before, by the way, when Tasmania was separated from the rest of Australia after the seas rose 20,000 years ago, or whatever it was. A small band of Tasmanians got stranded on, small band of Aborigines got stranded on Tasmania. And because there were so few of them, they kept on procreating, but there were so few of them that they actually lost knowledge. By the time they were rediscovered, their technology was backward compared to the technological advancement in Australia proper. Because when you have very few people, all that information is concentrated in the hands of very few people. So let's say that your society can only afford 3 fishermen, and they are out fishing, and suddenly they get blown away into the ocean, or they die in a sailing accident. Well, then your knowledge of fishing has gone with them. Or let's say that you have one guy in the village who can make shoes, and that guy gets a heart attack or gets eaten by a lion. Well, that's the knowledge which is gone. So I think that we certainly should be concerned about the potential for depopulation, and we shouldn't be worried about running out of resources, because if anything, resources are becoming cheaper. So have as many babies as you want, but please don't listen to the doomsters and the gloomsters. The future can be bright, but it's up to us. Nothing is guaranteed in the future. We have a madman in Europe and in other places threatening war. But based on past performance, it would seem that our future could be just as glorious, if not better.
And of course, the book, have babies, don't listen to the doomsayers, read the book. Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Managed to get that out right the first time, that one. Marian Tupy, and co-authored with Gail L. Pooley. You can also go to cato.org for the Cato Institute. Marian is a senior fellow there. Marian, thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you very much. And the book can be also found on superabundance.com. You can go to that website and buy that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marian. Stay tuned for one more message from the Ed Morrissey Show coming up next. Thank you for watching or listening to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and through the Town Hall Media Player, or you can just come to hotair.com and watch my podcast for free. However, I'd also love to have you join us as members of our VIP and VIP Gold programs. That allows us to defeat the stranglehold that big tech has on information and get you the best information that we possibly can. Plus, we have a lot of new value-added content coming to us from Town Hall Media stars and my good friend Adam Baldwin. He and I are doing the video series, The Amiable Skeptics. It's 1 hour of discussion a week, strictly for our VIP and VIP Gold members. Plus, we have our VIP Gold chat with Kem Edwards every Wednesday afternoon at 1:30 p.m. We'd love to have you as members. Be sure to join up. Thanks again for watching the Ed Morrissey Show podcast.